Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 6th, 2024. It's Friday, so I'm taking your questions, and I have to say I received a lot of questions on my update yesterday on the trip to Greek classics to the Orestian trilogy by Aeschylus as a way of getting a handle on what's happening in the world today. The question comes up from many of you. Is the chaos in the world the result of a plan, a failed plan? What exactly is going on? What's behind it? And many of you, I think, are convinced that the result of the planning of the oligarchy is, in fact, moving us toward World War III. So I want to address that and start by bringing up a couple of old sayings. Man plans and God laughs. But that starts with the idea that there's something preordained outside of man's control. And I would say that's not accurate. God gave us the creative capability to make changes. And we have free will to do that. Which then brings us to a second saying from Louis XIV. Après nous le déluge. After us, the flood. So let's delve into this because it's clear chaos has been unleashed in the world. So yesterday, in referring to Aeschylus and his Orestian trilogy, I discussed the question of who can bring order out of chaos. Of course, that's in the book of Genesis, that's the responsibility of God, but then God did create us in his image. So now it becomes our responsibility. And that's exactly what Aeschylus, in the middle of the 5th century BC, demanded of the Athenian citizenry through the voice of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and justice. Essentially, she said, the citizens must become the guardians of justice. So let's start by taking a look at what actually is going on in the world. And the problem is that most governments are run by special interests, by private interests, whether you call it the military, industrial, financial complex, or the Mickey Mad, as Ray McGovern does, defense contractors, London and Wall Street speculators who run the global banking and financial system, and the central banking system, the Federal Reserve, and so on. Essentially, these are the people who fund wars. They fund debt relief for corporations. They have no commitment to provide credit for the general welfare, for necessary infrastructure, or to reindustrialize. Instead, they pump money into the hands of the private interests who have run up unpayable debts while tearing down the solution to the debt, which is namely the physical economic structure and the destruction of research and development, advances in science, which provide new technologies which are the source of the wealth that's needed to pay down the debt. Now, let's look at the latest results of these governments. Start with France, where the French Parliament fired Prime Minister Barnier. France now has no government, no budget, but Macron continues to thumb his nose at the population and the voters, looking for a technocratic solution. Monsieur Macron, what happened to democracy? What happened to the will of the governed? You can't take that for granted forever. And France has a tradition of Jacobin mobs overrunning an oligarchy which is out of control. Is that going to happen again? Then we have the media and the establishment cheering on the assault on Syria by jihadists run by a former al-Qaeda leader. They're not just cheering it on, they're supplying them with weapons, they're supporting them, providing them with logistics. Let's look at Jake Sullivan, one of the two leading people in controlling the hapless occupant of the White House, Joe Biden. Sullivan said this the other day about the situation in Syria, quote, "We don't cry over the fact that the Assad government, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, are facing certain kinds of pressure," unquote. Jake, certain kinds of pressure? How about a genocide against Syrian Christians, Druze, the Shia? Is that what you call pressure? Remember, in February 2012, Sullivan sent an email to Hillary Clinton, who was supporting the jihadists then. And Sullivan wrote in the email, quote, "Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria," unquote. It still is. But whose side is that? Remember, this is the same Sullivan who, with Blinken, is arming war criminals in Israel, allowing the CIA to arm and train and direct jihadists in Syria, providing massive amounts of money and weapons to the kleptocrats in Ukraine, and are pushing for a color revolution in Georgia. Bad, huh? That's what we're facing. Out of control oligarchy, trying to defend an order which is collapsing. If this is their plan, it's a pretty stupid plan. It's not going to work. Now, you could argue that they're suicidal, and I think that's, in some cases, true, or completely delusional, that they can escape the deluge by going into deep underground bunkers. Well, let's take a look at the warning from Lyndon LaRouche, which, again, I presented yesterday in this context. LaRouche's writings on tragedy. He basically said, there are bad leaders, and there's no question that they're driven by greed, they're corrupt, they're anti-human, they believe in themselves as gods of Olympus, but they're the product of a failed system, one that's tolerated by voters, under the dominant influence of a degenerate culture, a culture that they have contributed to degenerating by pushing the whole rock, sex, drug counterculture, which is now morphed into the woke culture, which goes against most beliefs of the major religions of the world. And yet they wonder why people are rebelling. Now, let me give you a prime example of this idea of promoting a corrupted system. And I take it from the December 6th issue of The Economist magazine, which was a magazine started in the middle of the 19th century, funded by the bankers of London, including the Rothschilds, and it remains the mouthpiece for the City of London to this day. Their cover story in the December 6th issue is about the gambling boom in America. And they write about $150 billion in betting on legal sports wagers alone. And they correctly say this was unleashed by overturning bans on gambling, the rise of betting apps, and a, quote, booming economy, unquote. Well, that's certainly questionable. It's only booming if you're an oligarch or a person who has vast control over the hedge funds and the equity markets and so on. But they conclude the article by saying that this should be celebrated, not feared. The fact that people are relying on betting to try to survive is good. And they go on to say that, yes, it's true, gambling is a, quote, ruinous addiction, unquote. And it's disproportionately played by the poor. In other words, those who are desperate, who are having trouble finding the means to pay for housing, for transportation, for medical care, for food for the family, who resort to gambling or another form of gambling using credit cards with high interest rates in the hopes that somehow they'll be able to pay it off. Now, is that the plan of the oligarchy? Well, it is. So the question is, why do people tolerate it? And the answer is that toleration has come to an end. We're seeing a rebellion globally against the so-called gods of Olympus, the oligarchs who control the financial system, control governments, and that's why governments are falling. It's not just the French government, it's the German government. The British government fell and is about to fall again because Starmer is a complete product of the same City of London forces that Sunak was. And we see their push toward the brink of war. So let's go back to Aeschylus and the answer provided by the goddess Athena. She told the Furies, who were the goddesses of vengeance, to stop tormenting and torturing people and instead to become the guardians of justice. And this was then relayed through this play by Aeschylus to the citizens of Athens who flocked to see it, to see the three plays, that it's up to the citizens to be the guardians of justice. Don't rely on the so-called gods who have other interests. In the case of the Greek gods, who spent most of their time chasing around each other's wives and husbands, looking for a moment of pleasure. It's up to the citizens. Same way in dealing with this crisis now. Cut the funding for wars. Cut the independence of the so-called financial centers, the central banks that are controlled not by governments, not by the will of the people, but by the speculators. This is a system that will not survive. And the fact that these governments are falling gives us an opportunity now. And that's why we have put together a conference this weekend, the Schiller Institute, which includes speakers from many countries, from politics, from the military and veterans, from labor, who are getting together to discuss, to have a dialogue about how do we get out of this. And we see that the global majority is already moving in that direction with the BRICS, with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the so-called de-dollarization, which, as Putin himself said the other day, it's not to get rid of the dollar, it's to give countries an alternative to the weaponization of the dollar in the hopes that the Western countries will stop their predatory policies and become partners with the global majority. So our conference is titled, In the Spirit of Schiller and Beethoven, All Men Become Brethern. This is the classical idea, which again, if you go back to Aeschylus, you see it portrayed beautifully in the Orestian trilogy. The conference begins Saturday, December 7th at 9 a.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Central European time. And it will be a 2-day conference, 4 panels, taking up strategic matters, scientific questions, and the last panel on culture, why we need a classical renaissance to change the way people think, to avoid tragedy. I urge you, take the time this weekend, spend part of your weekend watching and discussing this conference, and join the Schiller Institute to create a world in which all men are truly brethren. Thank you. See you again next week.